there are at least 3 reasons why labour regulation could harm innovation. One of them is the one I've suggested. The second is that firms might still innovate, but the innovation wouldn't get so far because they don't have the muscle necessary to bring their innovation to a bigger market. So, they still do some of the R&D, they produce a nice little product, but they don't commercialize the product with the same kind of emphasis and energy. But then there's a third argument, and this is where the paper by Quaternam and Cost is, I think, really interesting, is that they might become less attractive to acquirers because what does an acquirer do with an innovative firm that it acquires? Now, we've been hearing a lot about so-called killer acquisitions, and no doubt there are some killer acquisitions, but I mean, the main reason, if you're a large innovative firm like Google or Microsoft, if you acquire a small innovative firm, is you want to use that firm. You want to integrate that innovation into your broader ecosystem, okay? Now, in order to do that, you have to be very nimble, and in particular, you have to restructure. And so what Quaternam and Cost say is that the main problem may be a lack of agility of corporate decision-making. If you're going to incorporate a truly innovative process into your broader ecosystem, you have to be able to fire some people and then hire some other different people, and you have to be able to take the decisions according to what the economic logic dictates and not according to what the legal rulebook dictates. And so they have some nice contrast in what they call between the agility of corporate decision-making in the US, citing as an example what happened when ChatGPT first came out. And there was immediate response by firms like Google and Microsoft, instantly firing quite a lot of people, hiring quite a lot of people. Many of the people they fired got hired by other people. And they compared that with the restructuring plans that were announced by Nokia, SAP, Ericsson, and even Volkswagen for its software division. And these are restructuring plans that take a minimum of 2 years, sometimes 3 years, they have to be voted by the works councils. Often the works councils can delay the restructuring. So you have a very big disincentive on the part of these large firms in Europe to acquire the small startups because just integrating them into their larger ecosystem is going to be very much more costly. Okay, so let's return to that framework I promised you for assessing the costs of the claims of the Draghi Report. And I'm going to be very sort of quick and kind of rather brutally unnuanced. I asked, where geographically do the benefits and costs of integration accrue? Well, is it where the company's headquarters are located? Rarely. I'm going to show you some evidence for that with respect to profits. But also think about what else you get if you get the HQ. You also get the CEO. I mean, if you want a 2-word answer to why it's not always great to have the HQ in your country, the 2 words would be Elon Musk. Elon Musk produces fantastic products. As a Tesla owner, I can tell you it's the best car I've ever owned. It's the only car in my entire life that I actually enjoy driving. And Elon Musk, as an entrepreneur, has done amazing things. As a CEO in the wider political ecosystem, he's toxic. We're actually very lucky not to have Tesla located in Europe because we get most of the benefits of the product, and well, we do suffer a bit the cost of the CEO, but not as much as the Americans do. Now, I'll come back to that in a moment. Second issue is, what about where the R&D takes place? Well, yes, there are often some important spillovers there. We know that R&D is something where, if you have a location where a lot of people are working in R&D for different companies, there's a kind of exchange of ideas, people move from one country to another. Silicon Valley is productive precisely for that reason. So yeah, there are some things there. What about where manufacturing takes place? Well, basically, that's true for skilled labor, but not for the rest, okay? And then what about where the customers are located? Nobody thinks of this, but the answer to that, and I'll show you some evidence in a moment, is very, very often. The biggest benefits happen where the customers are, not where the rest happens. So, does the answer differ mainly by sector, by specific activity, or by cluster? And I'm going to claim, and I apologize, the evidence for this is, I'm going very fast, is that it's much more by cluster than either by sector or by individual activity. And then it differs also by whether the innovation is used for zero-sum activities like defense or positive-sum activities like trade. And again, we're going to get back to why that matters. I've got 5 minutes, but I think I'm on time. So, where does the corporate social footprint really fall? And this is one of the key bits of the paper. You're going to get the slides. I haven't got time to go through it in detail, but I want to direct you to this very interesting paper by Hunt Allcott and co-authors, which takes an economic approach to estimating corporate social impact for 74 firms in 12 US industries. And he defines corporate social impact as the welfare loss that would be caused by the firm's exit. So how good is it that the firm's around, in the sense that if it disappeared, how much harm would that cause? Okay, that seems like a very reasonable definition. And in order to do this, they take all of these firms, they calculate the demand curves, the supply curves, they include consumer surplus, workers surplus, profit, and externalities. And they find that consumer surplus is overwhelmingly the largest component of corporate social impact. Absolutely dwarfs everything else. And that's even if you don't include things like all of the great free goods you get. Google Maps, which is sort of what got me here 25 minutes late instead of an hour and a half late, which is what I would have been without Google Maps. I mean, that's a zero price good. It's not included in the GDP statistics, but I benefit from that a lot. And that's even though Google is headquartered in California. But the bottom line from the Allcott et al. Study is that profits are basically peanuts. It really doesn't matter where the profits take place. They're too small. Okay, I know you've all been told, capitalism is killing us, it's extracting profits, but profits are tiny compared to all of these other components. Okay, now look at the paper, don't just take my word for it. I'm going to run through, I'll show you 3 things from the paper. I haven't got time to go into them, but I would strongly recommend you look at them. Now, what they don't do is measure these complex innovation externalities, what I call the clusters. So I want to think about how we might do that. Here are some graphs, but basically I'll talk you to the last point, which is for the whole of US industry. The benefits from these are very largely to do with consumer surplus, which is blue. This is the total of profits, but of course, if you think that it's not necessarily such a good thing that profits go to very rich people, then you might want to weight profits less, and you might want to say that the general benefits of these firms are going to be ones where consumer surplus matters most. But even if you weight profits as much as consumer surplus is dwarfing all of these other components. So even externalities here are, they're pretty important for some. So the oil industry, they're massive. But the benefits to consumers of having these firms that are producing the things they want to buy are even more massive. Okay, I'm going to skip. So what are the lessons from the corporate social footprint? First of all, Europe benefits hugely from the consumer surplus generated by US-based firms. Hugely, okay? Now, not all of that is captured in the national accounts. In fact, quite a lot of it isn't. Again, I could go into the reasons for this. But it suggests that the comparison between US and EU growth is not nearly as bad as the GDP statistics suggest, because we are benefiting a lot from unaccounted consumer surplus from stuff that is made by firms located in the US. Now, there could then be many large untapped gains to producing more of what European citizens want to use, and not just what the firms want to produce. And so we need to focus on where the markets are failing to deliver. So one of my favorite examples is, why do we have 150 apps for ordering pizza very quickly, and 0 apps for helping you look after your elderly relatives, which is something I have to devote a lot of thought to, okay? That's partly because all of these guys in Silicon Valley order a lot of pizza, but they don't seem to spend much time looking after their elderly relatives, either because they're too young to have any, or because they leave that to other unpaid members of their family. But, when I think what's going wrong, it's because a lot of the innovation is being driven by what the producers want to produce, not by what we, the users, might want them to produce on our behalf. Okay, nearly there. So, if we go back to market failures, where is the EU innovation market failure? Well, some of these things may be regulation failures. So I talked about things that stop firms from growing. Or there's regulations fragmenting the EU market, preventing the realization of scale economies. I'm going to come back to that in a second. Others may involve cluster externalities, okay, benefits for upstream and downstream producers. And that's really what went wrong in the battery case. Nobody thought, okay, you locate this battery firm in northern Sweden. Okay, supposing it works. You've got a whole lot of high-skilled people all producing batteries. Who else is going to benefit from that? Some reindeer. I mean, honestly, there's no cluster for them to be a part of. Okay? And there are no plans for a cluster for them to be a part of. That was the other weird thing. Now, how are you going to value them? That's tricky. It takes a lot of, the work done by Allcott and others is really tough. Sometimes you need to do this at equilibrium, but you also need the notion of an option value. So, how many of you think the option value of semiconductor reshoring is high? Well, I think it's really high. If you haven't been watching China's recent blockade of Taiwan, you haven't been paying attention. The probability that the semiconductor supply chain could be seriously disrupted in the next 5 to 10 years is really high. Okay, that is not something that individual semiconductor manufacturers are necessarily taking account of. Okay, and it's not clear that the semiconductor supply chain is internalizing that externality. It's a big deal. It should be thought about. It's not really thought about enough. Now, quickly, the sheer scale of things in the US is sometimes hard to get your head around. So, I mentioned Elon Musk. 57% of the US electronic vehicle market is due to him alone. And of course, a lot of the other things are sort of copycats of Tesla. But it's not just electronic vehicles. Did you know that Starlink satellites now make up 60% of all active spacecraft in orbit? This is massive. Did you know that Elon Musk set up 100,000 NVIDIA GPUs in 19 days? A process that normally takes 4 years. Try to imagine a European entrepreneur doing that. Try to think through what are the obstacles to doing it in Europe. So, the big elephant in the room is that if you're going to restructure, some activities have to disappear. And this is where I can come back to defense. The report correctly notes that Europe's defense industry is too fragmented. 12 different types of battle tanks are operated in Europe, whereas the US produces only one. It does not then draw the obvious conclusion that although this is firm-driven choice crowding out user-driven choice, that at some point the firms producing 11 of those types of tanks at least are going to have to decide to stop. And the report gives zero thought to how that is going to be managed. But, if you see the Doliprane defenders are out in force saying, actually, what we need is Doliprane as a, strategic sector for the European pharmaceutical industry. How on earth are you going to get tank producers to accept that maybe, how much is it? 12 different types. 11 of them should maybe restructure and do something else. So if we're going to have any hope of improving European innovation, we need to enfranchise the user and not just the producer. And this, as famously Charles de Gaulle was supposed to say, is un vaste projet, monsieur. He said this allegedly in response to a demonstrator in front of the Élysée Palace who was holding up a panneau, what do you call it? We call it a panneau in English. A sign saying "Mort au con, vaste projet, monsieur." And so I want to suggest that empowering the user is a vaste projet, but it's important. So my last slide, there's lots of good things in the Draghi Report, but there's no framework. It really is everything everywhere all at once. Market failures are mentioned once. The sentence says they should be clearly specified, but the report never goes on to specify them. It completely ignores them, having mentioned them once. Okay, so what's the answer to my question? Does Europe have an innovation deficit? Yes, probably, but it's smaller than it appears, okay? Because of, remember, all of these consumer benefits we get from other countries. And it's not measured by where the innovative firm's HQ is located. Secondly, yes, it matters for living standards, but also, and this is something the report's quite good on, but it's something that is missing from a lot of the general discussion, which is that it matters for geostrategic competition with China and Russia. Because there, it really is important that you can produce, if you look at Russia-Ukraine right now, you need to produce drones. That's what the Ukrainians are discovering. Now, they've been, increasing their drone production dramatically, but having the ability to ramp up drone production in the event of a major conventional war is a really big deal and not something that people are thinking about. In fact, drones are more important than tanks. The Draghi Report mentions tanks, doesn't really give much attention to drones. But you have to focus on the market failures, and you need to empower the user. And you've got to remember that Doliprane-style defenders are around every corner. If it's not Italian tomatoes, if it's not French Doliprane, they'll come up with some other reason for telling you that some sector that they derive a lot of benefits from is really strategically important. And you know, maybe you say, well, this is how we do things in Europe. It's all part of the culture. It's all, you know, part of what it means to be European. Fine, but then we will remain a slow innovating region for the next few decades.